How to Sew the Carefree Cacti by Amber Meggs. Follow me and I'll show you how to make this beautiful trio of cacti, all planted in their pots. They're easy and fun to make. Cutting out. Take the fabric panel from your kit and give it a good press and then have a look at it, and you can see there are lots of pieces on this panel, but they're all labelled with a label just above them. You need to cut round all the pieces and then pin the label to the top of the right side of each piece, and then you'll know which is which and also which is the top. You can see there are lots of little pieces because there are 3 cacti and they've all got different pieces on them so that you can make all the different sections and segments, but they're all labelled, so do make sure that you cut them out carefully and pin the labels to them. You'll also need some wadding, that's used for the pot and one of the cacti, a little bit of soft toy filling, and also some cotton fabric if you want to add some weighting, but the information for that is given in the instructions. Once you've cut them out, they'll look like this. So you can see this is pot 1 and I've got the body, the rim and the base. I'm going to clip those together just so that they stay, because there are 3 pots and it's important that you use the right pieces for the right pots so that they all match. And then that's the 3rd pot. So I've just clipped them together but also pinned the label to them. These are the pieces for the grit. There are 6 of these and these are used for the top of the pot that the cactus is planted into. These are the 6 pieces for the Ferocactus. So again, I've just pinned the label to one of them and then clipped them together. These are the pieces for the Saguaro cactus. So you've got 2 pieces for the body. You've got the left trunk and the right trunk. And again, I've just clipped these together. And then you've got pieces for the flower. I've kept 3 of the pieces already on the fabric because I'm going to use Bonder web to stick mine together. And then I've cut 3 out, but the information is in the instructions for how to do the flowers, which you can read about and watch later. These are all the pieces for the prickly pear. So you've got pads, medium, bottom pads, top pads and mid pads. Again, I've clipped those all together because there's quite a few of these and it just helps to keep them all sorted. And the prickly pear has more flowers, and again I've kept half of the flowers onto the background and the other half I've cut out because I'm going to Bonder web mine together and it's easier if you do it like this. Then you need to also cut the wadding out. The information and the instructions and the measurements are in the printed instructions, so cut out all of those pieces following those measurements because you will need to add some padding to the prickly pear as well as the pots. And these are the pieces for the prickly pear. So put all of those to one side and then you're ready to start sewing. Making the Ferocactus. Take one of the Ferocactus body pieces and turn it wrong sides up. Now you need to turn the bottom edge over by 1/4 inch. So if you measure and mark 1/2 inch up from the straight edge, then fold that straight edge so it meets that mark, then you folded it over by 1/4 inch. So give that a press to just hold it in place. And that will neaten the edge when you're stuffing it later. And then take another Ferocactus body and do the same thing. Turn the bottom edge over by 1/4 inch to the wrong side. Now place these 2 pieces together. Take the labels off first because the pins will get caught when you're turning it right side out. So place them right sides facing. They're exactly the same size and pin them together matching raw edges. And also where the turned under edges are, just pin those into place because it's important that when you stitch it together that those are held securely into place. So I pin them into place and then just pin it all the way around the edge matching the raw edges. The section where the curved bit meets the straight bit, I pin it there first. It just helps, that's an anchor point and just helps to keep that in place, and then you can pin around the curves. And again with the other end, pin those folded over edges into place at the top and bottom, and it just means that you will stitch over them correctly. Now once you've done that, sew it together all the way around, starting at one end all the way around the other and at the bottom, but obviously leaving the straight edge unstitched. And then it will look like this. So you can see the bottom edge is unstitched because that's where you're going to stuff it. Now we're going to make a few clips here. So where the straight edge meets the curved edge, just cut out a notch. That just will help it to turn right side. When it turns right sides out, you'll have a neater edge. And then do that on the other side. By reducing the bulk and cutting this notch, it means that you will get a nice, smooth point there when you turn it right sides out. And because of the curve, to help this seam to lay nice and flat, just cut small snips all the way along. The snips need to be about 1/4 of a half inch to apart, and then just up to the seam, but not actually in it. Do make sure you don't cut into the seam, otherwise the sewing will come undone. If you do by accident, don't worry, just pop it back under your machine and sew over it again. But just cut all the way around, and it just means that when you turn this right sides out later, the seam will open up more and lie flatter, and then you'll get a much more smooth curved edge. Now once that's done, you can turn this Ferocactus body pair right sides out. So just put your finger into the bottom and then push it so you get that bottom edge, and then pull it all the way through. The gap at the bottom is big enough for you to allow you to be able to do this. Now once you've got it right sides out, just push your fingers in just to ease it all out so that the seam is laying on the edge. And then fold that bottom and make sure that the folded under edges stay folded under. They might have come out unfolded a little bit while you were turning it right sides out, so just fold them back under. Now to make sure that the seam is laying right on the edge, use a blunt item, like I use the stick for my turning tool, but you can use anything like the end of a blunt pair of scissors, but just something that you can run along the seam to make sure it's laying on the edge. And then take the time now to give it a press. You'll get a much neater finish if you press it so that this seam is laying on the edge all the way around, and the folded under edges at the bottom are still folded under. If you roll the seam between your fingers and then press it, that's the best way. If you find it's quite creased, which it probably will because you've turned it right sides out, a quick spray with water before you press it, or use a little bit of steam, will help to get all the creases out. Now once you've made one body pair, repeat that another 2 times to make 3 Ferocactus body pairs in total. Now take one of them and measure and mark the centre. So measure across the curved section and mark the centre. And then measure across the straight stem section at the bottom and mark the centre. Now draw a line matching up these points. So this line, I'm using an erasable pen here. You could use it lightly in pencil or a chalk marking pencil, goes down the centre, and this is going to be a sewing line. Now place your 3 Ferocactus body pairs, one on top of each other, but the one with the drawn line needs to go on top, and arrange them very carefully so that all the edges match up, so they sit exactly on top of each other, like this, and you can see the drawn line on top. And then pin them together. You're going to sew along the line, but it's easier if you can keep the pins in place as you're sewing, because you're sewing through 6 layers of fabric. So just pin about 1/2 inch outside of the line, just far enough so that you can keep the pins in whilst you're sewing, and this will just help everything to stay in place. Now once you've done that, sew the 3 pairs together down the line, but reverse stitch at the top and bottom. It's important that this line is strong. And now you can see, if you open it up like this, you've got 6 separate sections which are going to form the body of the Ferocactus. Now you need to stuff each one of these sections, so just take a small amount of soft toy filling or stuffing, pull it apart to put some air into it, and then it won't be so lumpy, and then push it in the gap, one of the sections a little bit at a time. I'm using the blunt end of the stick for my turning tool here, but just use something like this that you can just push it in. You'll find it does take a little bit of time, but once you just push a little bit in, then the rest of it goes in evenly. But take your time to push all of the stuffing in. Once you've got a little bit in, push it all the way up to the top, because the idea is you need to fill the Ferocactus all the way right up to the top. But if you just use small amounts, then you'll find it won't be so lumpy. So just keep going in this way until one of your sections look like this. It's firmly filled, the seams are laying on the edge. I've filled it right to the end. And then repeat that with all 6 sections, and you will gradually see your Ferocactus taking shape. So once you've filled them all, they'll look like this. So you've got a nice plump cactus here, and you can see that the little V's that were printed on the panel now form the spines of the cactus. So all you need to do now is just slip stitch the bottom closed. Now this edge is going to be right inside the pot when you finish, so you won't see it, but you don't want any of the filling to start leaking out after a while. So I'm just over sewing. You can slip stitch or over sew, but this, it doesn't have to be neat, it's just to keep the stuffing in. So push the stuffing in, because you can see mine is poking out a bit. Push in one section and then over sew just to keep everything in place. You see I'm just working from one side to the other just to hold it all in. And then work your way around to do all 6 sections in the same way. And then it will look like this. You can see it all over sewn, all the stuffing's in, and your Ferocactus is now finished and ready to be planted when you've made its pot. Making the Saguaro cactus. Let's start by making the trunk and arms. Take the 2 body trunk pieces and turn the bottom edge over by 1/4 inch to the wrong side and press it, just like you did with the last cactus. Now place these 2 pieces right sides facing and matching all 4 edges, pin them together. Pin them together at the bottom edge first, making sure that those 2 turned under edges stay turned under by pinning them. And then pin them together all the way round. Then once you've done that, sew it together all the way around the edge, but leaving that bottom straight turned under edge open. And then it will look like this. Now to reduce the bulk, and because you've got quite a tight curve at the top, I'm going to take some notches out. So all you have to do is cut up to the seam, but not actually into it, and take out small V's. This just reduces the bulk in the seam allowance, so that when you turn it right sides out, the seam will lay flatter and will be more curved and smoother than if you don't. You could also do this using pinking shears. The only problem with that, you have to be very careful not to cut the seams, and it's quite a narrow seam allowance. So I tend to just cut the notches, and then I'm going to just cut the point off the notches because it just reduces the bulk even further. And then it will lay flatter when you turn it out. Once that's done, turn the trunk right sides out by pushing your finger right into the bottom, and then you can push with your thumb, push it all the way up to the top. Grab hold of it and pull it all right sides out. Now roll the seam between your fingers so that it's laying right on the edge. Tuck the turned under edge at the bottom so it's under, and then just use something to push, something blunt to push the seams so that they lay right on the edges. And then give it a press and it will look like this. So it's nice and flat and the seams are on the edges. And then just stuff it. Take small amounts of soft toy filling and push them in. This needs to be very firmly stuffed because this is how it's going to stay upright. The cactus doesn't have anything else in it. It just has the filling. But by stuffing it very firmly, it will make sure it stands up. So push it in right to the end. And again, you can use a blunt eye to push it in till it's really stuffed firmly all the way in. But because this opening is quite big, this is quite easy to do. So just push it all the way in, but use small amounts. If you put in a really big amount, it will end up lumpy. So just stuff it all the way, but using little amounts. And depending on what filling you've used, I always pull mine apart just to put some air into it, and then it lays nicer and less lumpy. So once it's really stuffily firmed, it will look like this. And then the bottom of this cactus will sit right inside the pot, so you won't see this end, but you need to sew it closed, otherwise the filling can start leaking out, and also you'll lose the structure of it. So just pin that straight edge together, and because you turned the edges under earlier, that will stay together. And then using a matching thread, just over sew the bottom together. Again, these stitches don't need to be really neat. It's going to sit right inside the pot anyway, but it just keeps the structure of the trunk and stops the filling coming out. So once you get to the other end, just work a few stitches on top of each other just to secure the thread. And then cut it off. And that's the saguaro trunk finished. We're now going to make the arms. The arms are made in the same way. So take the two right arm pieces, turn the straight edge over by 1/4 inch to the wrong side, just like you did with the trunk. Take the label off, otherwise you won't be able to turn it right sides out, but keep hold of it for now because we're going to put it back on afterwards. Place the two pieces right sides facing, making sure those turned under edges stay turned under, and pin them together. And then pin them together at the other side, because you can see from making the trunk, by sewing these turned over edges over, it holds them together, which means it's easier for filling it later, because you haven't got to try and turn the edges under after you've sewn it. It's easier if you turn them under first. Then pin it together all the way around. Do make sure the raw edges match as you're doing this. And once you've done that, sew it together all the way around, but obviously leaving the turned under edge open and unstitched. And then it will look like this. Now you need to remove some of the bulk in these seams, and also the seams need to open. So there's quite a tight curve where it meets the straight edge. With this one, I didn't cut any notches in it. I just found that if I snip the seam allowance about 1/4 inch apart, make the snips. The tighter the curve, the closer the snips need to be, but make sure that you don't snip into the seam allowance as you're doing this. And then once that's done, you can turn it right sides out. Now, I'm using my turning tube for this just because it's quite a small piece, but I've been able to use the largest tube. So push the tube inside and then push the stick and it will turn right sides. If you haven't got a turning tube, you can turn it right sides out. It just takes a little bit longer. Then run the stick or something that's blunt along the seams to make sure that they lay right on the edge. Roll them between your fingers and then give it a press, so that those seams are lying right on the edge. And also this will remove any creases that you got when you were turning it right sides out. So you can see now I've given it a good press. All the seams are laying on the edge, and now I can stuff it. So in the same way as you did with the trunk, use small pieces of stuffing and just push them in. Again, find yourself something like a blunt-ended stick or some blunt scissors that you can just ease the filling in, and always push it right to the end and make sure that the end is very filled, and then work your way down. Because it's much harder to fill it if you haven't got all the filling in at the end. Again, this needs to be stuffed very firmly so it stands up. When it's done, it will look like this. Now, you need to leave the open end open because of the way we're going to construct it. Pin the label back on, and then you'll remember which is the right arm and the left arm, and then put that to one side for now. The left arm is made in exactly the same way. Fold the straight edges under by 1/4 inch. Place it right sides facing. Take the label off because you're going to pin that back on later. Pin and then sew it together all the way around. And then stuff it in the same way as you did with the right arm. Pin the label back on, and then you'll remember which arm is which. And then your saguaro trunk, right arm and left arm are all ready for assembly. Assembling the saguaro. Take the trunk, and on the right hand side on the seam, measure 5 inches up from the bottom. So place your tape measure on the actual seam, put the 5 inch mark at the bottom edge, and then mark that with a pin. And this is where the top of the right arm is going to be. It just positions it in the right place by putting it on the seam. Now take the right arm, you can take the label off now, and place the top of the turned under edge. So the top of the arm, if you just push a pin through that, that needs to go where the pin is on the trunk. So if you push a pin through there and then push it into where the pin is in the trunk, you can hold it into place at the top. Then you can take the other pin out. Then place the bottom of the arm on the seam of the trunk. So make sure, by using the seam on the trunk, you know it's laying nice and straight. So put the seam on the bottom of the arm, on the seam of the trunk, and push the pin all the way through. Because it's nice and firmly stuffed, it's really easy to just pin it through. It's like using a pin cushion and it holds them in place. Then open up the bottom turned under edge. You have to push a bit of stuffing back in if it starts leaking out. And push the edges into the trunk so that they're opened out a bit. Once you've got a few pins in, it's a bit easier. With the first couple of pins, they slide out a bit. But once you've got a few pins in, it's a bit easier. So just anchor them by opening them up. So the idea is that it looks like the arms are growing out of the trunk. And then if you pin it then all the way around, pushing the stuffing in, then it will look like this. So it's all pinned neatly in place. And once you've got it all pinned in, sewing it is much easier. So use a matching thread and a hand sewing needle. Pull the needle through the trunk just below the arm. Leave a tail of thread because it stops it coming undone. You can snip it off later. And work a few stitches on top of each other just to secure the thread. Now you need to slip stitch the arm to the trunk. So push the needle under the trunk a little way and then over into the arm and then back into the trunk. So you're working small straight stitches that go from the arm into the trunk, and then work a longer stitch that goes through the trunk. I found the easiest way to do this was to stitch all the way round with my stitches spaced reasonably far apart as anchoring stitches. You can then go back and work stitches between them, but to just get it stitched into place, it's easier if you go round twice. Once you've sewn it into place and removed the pins, it will look like this. So I've just used all those little stitches to sew it in. And then when you've finished, just work a few over sewing stitches on top of each other just to secure the final end. And then push the needle out through the trunk so the end is within the trunk. Pull it slightly, snip off the thread, and that's the right arm attached. Now for the left arm, that's positioned a little bit lower than the right arm. So this time, from the bottom and on the left-hand side seam, measure 4.5 inches and mark this 4.5 inch point on the trunk. Now take the left arm and pin this into place in the same way. So place the top of the turned under edge onto the 4.5 inch mark and push the pin through the trunk, through the arm and into the trunk, just like you did with the right arm. And then pin the bottom on, so matching the seam of the arm with the seam on the trunk. Put the bottom on and then opening out the turned under edge, pin it into place. By opening out the turned under edge a bit, it just makes it look more like the arm is growing out of the trunk. So pin it into place. The more pins you put in, the easier you will find it to sew. But the pins will stay nicely in place because you've stuffed the trunk so firmly. So that's now all pinned neatly into place. And now you can sew it into place in the same way as you did with the right arm. And there we go. The left arm is now finished. So you've now assembled the trunk and the arms, and you've just got to add the flowers. Adding flowers. Take all the flower pieces and you need to sew these wrong sides together. You can do this by hand or use Bondaweb like I've done. So half of the flowers I cut out and the other half I press Bondaweb to the wrong side of. Then I cut round the outer edge of each one. So if you want to hand sew them together, cut round the outer edge of all of them, place them wrong sides facing, and then using a running stitch you can sew them together. But with Bondaweb, I just find it's a lot easier to press it onto the flowers if they're on a bigger piece of fabric, which is why I cut them out like this. And then cut them carefully round the edge. Then remove the paper backing from the Bondaweb. So if you use a pin and mark a cross on the back, then that just cuts through the paper and you can take the paper off. Also, the Bondaweb gives them a little bit of extra stiffness, but they work just as well if you want to sew them by hand. Then place the two flowers, so one with the Bondaweb, one without, wrong sides facing. If you move it around like this, they do actually match up. because the petals aren't all exactly symmetrical, but if you turn it round, it will match up with the two. And once they're pressed together, then you've completed one flower. So to make the flower into a shape, you need to make it into a cup shape. So use a matching thread and just secure the thread in the centre. Leave a tail of thread, otherwise it'll pull all the way through, and work 2 or 3 stitches on top of each other just so it's secure. And then you can snip off that thread end. Then I found the easiest way to do this was to fold the flower in half and then work a few stitches through the fold, just a little bit of the way down from the top. So I just worked a few through the fold, and then I folded it in half the other way, so it's like in quarters, and then worked a few stitches through all the 4 folds. And that turns it into like a little cup shape. And then that's your flower complete. Now I made 1 flower at a time and then sewed them on, because then the thread was still attached. I didn't have to attach the thread. But you can make all 3 of them separately like I've done here, and then you can just reattach the thread to sew them onto the cactus. So there's all the 3 flowers. Now take your saguaro, and you have to decide where you're going to put the flowers, entirely up to you. So I decided that I would put 1 on the top, and I'm going to sew that one on in a minute, and then I just put 1 on by the arms, but just push a pin through the centre of the flower in the place you want it to be, and then you can adjust it. Or you can just put 1 flower or 2 flowers or no flowers, entirely up to you, however many flowers you want. Just put them where you want and pin them into place, and then you can sew them. So I'm going to sew this flower into place. So put it where you want to be and like push a pin through like I've just done with the other flowers. And because my thread is already attached, I don't need to attach the thread. If you do, just over sew it through the flower just to attach it. Now push the needle through the cactus where you want the flower to be, back into the centre of the flower, and then back into the cactus. Do this 2 or 3 times, just enough to secure it. And because the flowers need to appear like they're growing out of the cactus, you don't want it to be too stiff, so just sew it through the centre. And once you've done that, then snip off the thread, and I've attached the other 2 flowers, so you can see here. So now my saguaro is finished with all of its flowers, and it's ready to be planted in its pot. Making the prickly pear. We're going to start by making the top pads. So there are bottom pads, mid pads and top pads, but we'll make the top pads first. So take all of them, you can see I've clipped them all together, and place 2 of them right sides facing. Match up all the raw edges and pin them together. Now sew the 2 together all the way around, starting at the bottom straight edge and finishing at the other, so leaving that bottom straight edge unstitched. And when they're sewn together, they will look like this. Now, because this is such a little piece, we really want to reduce the bulk, so I'm going to trim the seam allowance in half, so it's about 1/8 of an inch wide. It doesn't have to be exact, but just to reduce the bulk, and then you will find the top pad lays flatter. And also, where the straight bit meets the curved bit, just make a small little snip through the seam allowance up to the seam. That will just help it to lay flatter. Now you need to turn this right sides out. You can do this just by hand, or if you do have a turning tube, pop the tube inside, take the stick and push it right sides out. It's just a much quicker way of doing it. Then use the stick to push the seams so that they lay right on the edge, because they need to lay right and flat. And then give it a little press, roll the seams between your fingers and give it a press. Now make all of the top pads in exactly the same way, and you will have 7 top pads in total. Making the mid pads. So the mid pads have the top pads attached to them, and there are different numbers depending on how many the stem you're doing, because there are 4 stems to the prickly pear. This is all listed in the instructions. But to construct them, take 1 mid pad And for stem 1, take 2 top pads. Now you can choose where you place these. I've placed one to the right of the centre and one to the left. Move them around until you're happy with where they go. And then flip them over so that the top pad is right sides facing with that mid pad, and pin it into place. Pin it into place vertically because you need to be able to see the end of that pin, and then pin the other one into place. So some of the mid pads have one of these top pads, some have none, and some have 2. So pin it into place so you can see the pins, then take another mid pad please and place it right sides down on top. And then pin it together matching the raw edges. So the reason that you place those top pads in with the pins vertically is you need to be able to see them. You can move them so that they're through all the layers of the mid pad, the 2 mid pads, or you can leave them in place, but as long as you can see them to take them out as you're sewing, that's the most important thing. So pin this together all the way around so all the raw edges are matching. Now the mid pad has a little bit of structure to it, so take the prickly pear mid pad wadding, one of the pieces that you cut right at the beginning, and place this centrally on top. The measurements I gave for the wadding are much bigger than the mid pad so that you've got plenty of room to have it centrally on top. And then sew it together all the way around, but leaving that bottom straight edge open. And then it will look like this. Now trim the wadding so that it is level with the raw fabric edges all the way round. But it's much easier to sew a shape piece to a square piece of wadding rather than trying to cut the wadding in advance first. So once that's trimmed, then cut a little notch where the curved bit of the mid pad meets the straight bit at the bottom. Just cut a notch out there, just because that will help it to lay flat and remove that bolt from the corner. And then snip into the seam allowance all the way around. Because you've got all the layers of the 2 mid pads, some part of the top pad and the wadding, to help this seam lay flatter, it's best to snip it. And then cut out a little notch from that corner. Now you need to turn this right sides out. So again, I've used my turning tube for this, so just pop the tube inside. And then take the stick and push it all the way through. Just make sure when you get the stick that you push it through without a top pad piece, so just on the other side, just helps to push it through. And then once it's through, you can then pull it all the way right sides out. So that's that one mid pad finish for stem 1 because it has 2 top pads. Roll the seam between your fingers so it lays right on the edge, and then give it a good press because it will all be a bit creased. And that's one of the mid pads for stem 1 finished. They're all made in the same way for all of the mid pads, just different arrangements. That's the other one for stem 1. This is all listed in the instructions. For stem 2, I put a top pad on the right and the left hand side of the mid pads. For stem 3, I left one without a pad, top pad, one with, and stem 4 only has 1 mid pad. Making the bottom pads. Again, all the 4 stems have different arrangements, but they're all made in the same way. So to start off with, take 2 bottom pads for 1 stem. So take 1, now then take the 2 mid pads with top pads attached that you made earlier for stem 1 and place them in your chosen arrangement. Just move them around until you're happy. I've gone with top right and top left, and then turn them over so that the mid pad is right sides facing with the bottom pad, and pin it into place. This is the same way as you sewed the top pads in. Again, fold this one over. The raw edges need to match, and it needs to be facing inwards like this. Now you can see that those top pads are going to get caught in the seam, so just fold them up like this so they're out of the way of the seam. Just hold them into place and put the other bottom pad on top, because you can't pin them from that side because otherwise the pin will make it really hard to turn right sides out. So you just need to hold them in place while you pin the bottom pad together. Once you've pinned some of it together, you can then put a pin through to hold those top pads into place. So making sure all these raw edges match up and that none of the top and mid pads escape into the seam allowance, just match them up and pin it together all the way round. If you find those top and mid pads start flipping out and unfolding them, you can just fold them back in. And then once you've pinned it together all the way round, you can just pop a pin in to hold them into place. So now I've secured that, I'm just going to put a pin, and that will hold those top and mid pads, stop them coming into the seam. And then just pin it together around the bottom. So your two bottom pads are sandwiching your mid pad with top pads attached. Once you've pinned it together, place this centrally on top of the wadding piece, the bottom pad wadding you cut earlier, and pin it into place. You only need to put a couple of pins in here because it's just to hold it in place. You've already pinned the fabric together, it's just to stop it shifting. Now you can sew all of these layers together, start at one side, work all the way around and down the other side, but don't stitch across the bottom straight edge. And then it will look like this. So as you did with the mid pad, trim the wadding so that it's level with the raw fabric edges all the way round. I'm just removing a couple of pins because I left the pins in from my mid pads, but luckily because they were facing upwards I could just go over them. But do make sure that all the pins are removed before you turn it right sides out. Now cut a notch out of the section where the curved bit meets the straight bit, again because there's a lot of bulk here, and this will help it to be much smoother and curve better by removing all of that bulk. You can snip into the seam allowances as well if you like, it's entirely up to you. I didn't with this one because there was so many layers, but you can. Now pop your turning tube inside and turn it right sides out, or if you don't have a turning tube, just carefully turn it right sides out. Push it all the way through. Now this will take a little bit of adjusting and movement, where you just have to pull it down from one side and then the other side and work all your way around to pull it out, just because there's a lot of layers. But if you persevere, it will all come out and it will look like this. It's all a bit creased now, obviously, because it's a bit tight inside there, but don't worry, a bit of pressing will remove those. So turn everything right sides out and then roll the seam so it lays right on the edges, and I would give it a tiny little spray with just a little bit of water, and that will help to remove the creases. And then stitch it together across the bottom edge, just 1/4 of an inch up from the bottom like this. This just holds it closed, and this will be inside the pot. So there's stem 1. Make stem 2 in the same way, using the mid pads that you put aside for those. And there's his stem 3, so you can see these have all got different numbers of arrangements of mid pads and top pads. And there's stem 4 with its 1 mid pad. So there's all your stems ready for adding flowers to. Adding flowers. The prickly pear flowers are made in exactly the same way as the saguaro flowers. There are enough pieces to make 8 flowers, so either bond or web them together like I did with the saguaro flowers, or cut them all out and running stitch them together, and then make them into the little cup shapes by over sewing halfway and then 1/4 way like you did before. Now because I've got 8 flowers here, the best thing to do now is to lay out all of your prickly pear stems and put the flowers on top, so you decide where you want them to be. I only actually used 7 flowers for mine in the end. When I put them all into position, I decided that was how many I needed, but it's entirely up to you. But just lay them all flat because you've got all the flowers made, and then you can choose where they go and the best place for them. I tended to put them in the places where the extra top pad I hadn't sewn on, but they looked quite nice on the bodies as well. Now to attach them, they are sewn on in the same way as the saguaro flowers. So using a matching thread, attach the thread by over sewing a couple of stitches through the centre of the back of the flower. And once the thread is attached, place it in the position on the prickly pear you want it to be, and then sew it into place by working 2 or 3 stitches into the prickly pear. I've actually sewn mine through the seam here. And then just to make sure you want it to be secure so that the flower is standing upright, just work a few stitches then through the centre of the flower and then into the prickly pear. And then over sew to complete so that it's all finished off. And then this is what it'll look like when it's finished. So you can see how the flowers are over sewn and they're all standing nice and secure, and all the stems, all 4 of them, are now finished, and you're ready to plant them in their pot. Making the grit. Now we're ready to start making the pots. So to make the grit for one pot, take 2 grit pieces and place them right sides facing. They're exactly the same size and shape, so match up all the raw edges, and we're going to sew them together along the top edge. So pin them together along this top straight edge. There's an extra seam allowance included in this so that when you sew it together it forms a perfect circle. Now we need to leave a turning gap because the turning gap is where you'll be planting the cacti and stuffing it. So measure the centre of that straight edge, and then measure and mark an inch either side of that, and that will be a 2-inch gap that will be left unstitched. So stitch from one end to the turning gap, one end to the other, so you leave it unstitched. Make sure you reverse stitch either side of the seams. Now open up the two pieces and place them wrong sides up and press that seam open and flat. So now you've got a gap in the grit that you'll be able to stuff through. But to make sure that stays in place, using a longer stitch on your machine, tack the seam allowance down either side. So this just holds it in place, which makes it easier for stuffing, but the gap is left, and that's one piece of grit finished. Making the pot body. Take all the pieces for pot 1. All the pots are made in exactly the same way, but make the whole of one pot in one go. So take the pieces for pot 1 and place the pot body right sides up centrally on top of the relevant wadding piece and press it into place, or if you're using fusible wadding, or tack if you're using non-fusible wadding, and then add quilting details if you want to at this stage. Take the pot body, the pot base, and place that right sides up onto the pot base wadding, and then add quilting details. So you can see with the pot body, I've quilted just along the printed lines. This just adds some structure, is worth doing, and then some detail. And then with the pot base, I've added some quilting as well. Now take the pot rim, make sure you use the same rim for the same pot. So pot 1 rim on pot 1 body. And place it right sides facing along the top of the pot body. It's been designed so that the shape and the curve is exactly the same on the pot rim as the pot body. So pin it together at one end and pin it together at the other end. So this is like adding a facing to something, but this is what creates the inside of the rim so the grit sits within the pot rather than on top of the pot. So pin it at either end, and then if you just adjust it to make sure the raw edges match up, it will fit exactly. It does look a bit like that the pot rim is bigger, but it's just because it's more wobbly because of the curves and also because it's a narrower piece. But if you just pin it together, I did it in the centre and then pinned either side of it. And I'm placing my pins vertically here so that I can get more in, but it will fit. You may just need to pull the pot body a little bit because of the wadding and the quilting. It can just pull it in, but if you just pull it out slightly, it will fit all the way along the top edge. Make sure they're right sides facing and that the raw edges are matching. Now once you've pinned it into place, sew it together all the way along the top edge. And then it will look like this, so the pot rim is now sewn to the pot body. Now because of the curve, to help it lay flatter, snip into the seam allowances. So make your snips about 1/4 inch apart and just up to the stitching, but not actually cutting the stitching. Make sure you snip through all layers of pot rim, pot body and the wadding as well, because this seam needs to lay right at the top of the pot, and these little snips just help to make it lay flatter and ease it out slightly, because it opens up the seam allowance so that when you press the pot rim upwards, it will just open it up and it will lie flatter. So take the time here to snip all the way along and making sure that you don't snip into the stitches. Once you've snipped all the way along, you now need to press the pot rim so that it's facing upwards and so that both seam allowances are facing upwards as well. Make sure when you press it that you're pressing it open and flat so that that seam isn't bunched up at all but is nice and flat. And also make sure that the seam allowances, as you do it, are both facing upwards, because the bulk of the seam needs to be in the pot rim section rather than the pot section. So you can see here, all the seam allowances are now facing upwards. Now fold the pot body and the pot rim in half so that those short, straight edges match. Pin it together at the bottom of the pot body and then make sure that the seam that you just sewed that joins the pot rim to the pot body matches up exactly. And to do this, if you push a pin through the seam on the top and then pull it apart a bit and make sure that pin goes through the seam on the bottom. Pull the pin, and that's just your anchor pin, and then place another pin that goes diagonally through from the one side of the seam to the other, and then you can remove that anchor pin, and then you can be sure that those seams match up. You'll just get a neater finish and it'll be more even. Once you've done that, you can then pin it together between the top and the bottom pins. Now sew it together from the bottom of the pot body all the way along the seam up to the pot rim, making sure those seam allowances stay facing upwards as you sew them. Now open it up like this and press this seam open and flat. And the seam allowances will face upwards because you sewed them so that they were facing upwards. Now if you turn it right sides out, that's your pot body with the pot rim attached. Just push the pot rim up and you're ready for the next stage. Assembling the pot. So now you need to mark and measure the quarter points on the pot. We're going to start with the base. So fold the base in half with the seam on the right hand side and mark with a pin where the fold is on the other side. So that's the halfway point. Now take that halfway point pin and place it so it's exactly underneath the seam, and put a pin in the fold on the left and put a pin in the fold on the right. I like to do it with the wrong sides out like this and put the pins on the right side just for when you're doing it together. So now you've got the quarter points matched. So you've got 3 pins and then the seam is the other quarter point. So those are exact quarter points. Now take the pot base and you need to mark the quarter points on this. So fold it in half and put a pin on one fold and then on the other fold. Make sure the heads of the pins are facing outwards and the points of the pins are facing inwards because they're easier to take out later. Now fold it in half again, making sure those 2 halfway pins meet up, and then put a pin on one side of the fold and put a pin on the other side of the fold. And now you have measured and marked exact quarter points of the base, which makes it easier to pinning into the body. So place the base inside the body so that they are right sides facing, and match up all the quarter points. So match up the seam of the body with one of the quarter pins on the base, make sure the raw edges match up, and then pin the 2 together at that point. Now work round to the next 2 quarter point pins, make sure that the pins match up and the raw edges match up, take out one of the pins, pin the 2 together and remove the other pin. Take the next quarter points, again match up the pins, match up the raw edges, pin together and remove the other pin. And then match up the final quarter pins. Always make sure the pins match up, which is why you've got them sticking up vertically and with the heads facing upwards. Now you can pin between these quarter points. So I found it was very easy to just adjust this, move it slightly, and you'll find that the raw edges will match up and the base fits perfectly inside the pot. If you have any difficulties at all, because it does depend on how much quilting you've done or whether you've pressed it and steamed it, the fabrics can change shape. You can make small snips within the seam allowance into the bottom of the pot body. That opens it up slightly and makes it easier for it to curve round the curved edge of the pot body base. But I found with mine, I didn't need to do that. It just fitted quite nicely. The more pins that you put in, the better. Because when you come to sewing it, you don't want to be fiddling with getting raw edges to match up. You just want to be sewing. So just work round gradually and you will find that the straight edge of the pot body matches the curved edge of the pot base. Make sure your pins are vertical because you can get more in that way, and they're also easier to take out while you're sewing. Or if you sew slowly, you can just keep them in. Just be very careful when you sew over them that you don't break your needle. I tend to keep mine in because I always sew these quite slowly and it's easier to deal with. Now you can sew the base to the body. Make sure that the body is uppermost and the base is at the bottom, because the base is circular, so that's a fixed shape. Because the body you have manipulated, it's easier to make sure it's crease free if you've got that. Now look, this is what it looks like when the base is sewn into place. So now we're going to find and mark the half quarterway points of the top of the rim. So with the seam on one side in exactly the same way, fold it in half and put a pin in the fold on the opposite side. You're putting this in the rim, not the body. Now take the seam and match it up with that halfway mark pin. Fold it so that you find the opposite side and put a pin in there. Again, put it in the right side and make sure the head of the pin is at the top and the pin is vertical. And then mark the other quarter point by again matching up the halfway pin and the seam, and carefully fold it all the way over, and then you've got the other quarter point. Now we're going to sew the grit circle into the top of the pot. So you need to find the quarter points of this. You've already got the 2 halfway points because that's the seam. So fold it in half so that the seams match up. And you can actually just lay this flat, and if you finger press it, then you will be able to see the little creases and pop the pins in again with the heads facing upwards and put them in vertically. So 2 of the quarter points are the seams and the other 2 quarter points are the pins. And you now need to pin this into the top of the rim in the same way as you did with the base. What I did with mine though, so I wanted the cactus facing a certain direction, is the seam on the grit I didn't match up with the seam on the pot, and that just means that you can have the seam at the back of the pot, but the cactus when you put it in is then going across straight. It doesn't really matter too much, it's just a little point of detail that if you make sure that the seam of the grit doesn't match up with the seam of the pot, then you'll be facing the right way. So exactly the same as you did with the base, pin together at the quarter points matching the pins and the raw edges, and then pin between in the same way as you did with the base, and then sew the 2 pieces together. And then your pot will look like this. So you've now got the grit sewn in and the base sewn in. So because you've got that nice 2-inch turning gap in the grit, you can pull the pot right sides out. And this is why you can see it was a good idea to tack the edges of the seam allowance down of the grit, because it stops them all folding out because you've got to pull it all out that way. So just put your fingers inside to push out that seam on the base so that it's nice and flat. And if you like, you can press it at this stage as well. So push that all in and then push out all the seams. Now we need to press it so that the seam that joins the grit to the rim is inside, but the seam that joins the rim to the body needs to be lying on the edge. So you can see that the pot rim is on the inside, and that seam that you sewed right at the beginning joining the rim to the body, place that and roll it between your fingers so it's right on the very edge, because this is going to sit at the top of the pot, and press it all the way round. It's definitely worth doing this stage, although you've got to work in little bits all the way around and keep rearranging it and folding it. It will make sure that that seam is sitting right on the top edge and you'll get a neater finish. So you can see now that the rim is on the inside of the pot. Now to hold that in place, we're going to sew it. So first of all, pin it together. So with the seam at the top, pin it so that rim is facing inwards. When you pin it, just check. You can see that it's flat on the inside, but just turn it over and just check that the pot body is flat and you haven't got any little creases. So as I place each pin in, I just turn it over and just check. Once you've pinned all the way around, you now need to sew it all together on top of the seam that joins the rim to the grit. And that will hold the rim inside. And then it will look like this. So you can see I've sewn it on top of the seam that joins the grit to the rim. It's all nice and flat on the outside. And now you've got a little pot where the grit is sitting. On the inside, you've got a nice pot rim, so it looks really realistic. And then repeat this whole process to make all 3 pots in exactly the same way. So there's pot 2, and there's pot 3. So your pots now are all ready to have the cacti that you've already made planted inside them. Planting the cacti. Now, if you want to add a little weight to your pot to help it stand up firmly, then make a little filling bag. The measurements for this are given in the instructions. Fold the top edge of the fabric square over by 1/2 inch and then fold it in half with right sides facing. I've just used a plain white cotton fabric for this, and then pin it together down the sides and across the bottom. You don't have to add weighted filling to your cacti, but I just find it gives it a bit of extra structure, help it stand up. Now sew it together across the bottom and up the side to make a little bag. Turn it right sides out, and then push out the corners and give it a press, making sure that folded under edge stays folded under. Now fill your bag. I've up to just halfway. I've used play sand for mine, but you can use rice or plastic pellets, entirely up to you, but just something to give it a little bit of weight, but only fill it halfway. Then pin it together across the top. Now to give the bag a little bit of shape, take the seam and match it up with the fold on the opposite side. It makes it a bit more like a sack, which makes it easier to get into the pot, but also makes it sit better because it's more like a sack shape. So if you just fold it across the top like this so that the seam matches the fold, pin it together, making sure those top edges stay turned under, then sew it together along the top, about 1/8 of an inch from the top and then 1/4 of an inch. These double rows of stitching just help to hold the filling in place. And that's your little weighted filling bag. You'll need one of these for each pot. Now take the pot that you're going to start with and pop the filling inside. So in order to get it through, if you put the end without any filling in and then shake the filling through, because the bag is slightly bigger than the hole, but you can just shake the filling through, ease it in gently, and then hold the top of the bag and shake the filling in. I like to hold the top of the bag and give it a shake, and then you can know that all the filling is sitting exactly on top, and then just push the rest of the bag inside, and now you've added a little bit of weight. You now need to stuff the pot using your soft toy filling, but only stuff it halfway. So what I did was put a little bit in, and then I eased it in so that it went around the edges of the filling bag, so between the filling bag and the side of the pot. You need to stuff this pot fairly firmly, and you don't really want the weighted filling to be on the outside. So if you just arrange the filling so it goes around the edges of the filling bag, it's only a little pot, so it doesn't take too long, but just push it in with your fingers so that you've got filling on the outside and the weighted filling on the inside, but only fill it halfway to this stage, about up there. Now we'll start by planting the Ferocactus. So 2 inches of the Ferocactus is going to sit underneath the grit. So you can mark this by measuring the 2 inches, but actually the 2 inches is where the straight bit meets the curved bit. So what I did was I just made sure that 2 inches was correct, and then I marked a pin on every other segment where the straight bit joined the curved bit, because the curved bit is the bit that will sit across the top of the pot. Now take the pot that you've half filled and plant the Ferocactus inside. So the turned under edge, so the turning gap of the grit needs to meet where you've put the pins on the Ferocactus. But before you sew and pin it into place, you need to stuff the rest of the pot. So what you've got to do here is that the Ferocactus will fill the centre of the pot. So this filling needs to go above the filling that you've already put in and then up to the grit, because you want the grit to be very slightly raised. You can take the cactus out if you like, but just make sure you don't fill it up too much, because you need to put it back in again, so you need a little gap in the centre. But I did find it easier, to be honest, to take the cactus out and then push the filling in so that it raised the grit very slightly. So make sure that your pot is fairly firmly stuffed, but that you've left a space to pop the cactus back in. You can ease the filling aside with your fingers like this, just like as if you were planting it, and then pop it in. Once you're happy that it's all filled nicely, pin the turned under edge, which you've tacked down, of the grit to the position on the Ferocactus that you marked where the curved bit meets the straight bit. And then if you fold the edges of the pot rim back, you've got much better access, because you can now see it. You just need to slip stitch the turning gap of the grit to the Ferocactus. So because you tap the grit down, that will stay nicely in place. If you haven't done that, it's quite hard to turn it over. So what I did is worked round once by working a small stitch into the cactus and then a small stitch into the grit. The best thing to do is stitch it all round once, so that you've got maybe just one stitch into each segment of the cactus, and then go round it all again working into the spaces left in the first stitches, because this first row is more of an anchoring row and then the second row is to secure it. It needs to be nice and secure, because when you're moving your cactus around, you might pick it up by the cactus rather than the pot. So it just needs to be nice and secure. But it's really easy to sew, because if you fold the pot rim back, you can get to it quite nicely. So work all the way round. Use a thread that matches the cactus for this. And make the stitches really small so that they're almost invisible. Once you've sewn all the way around, it will look like this. So all you need to do now is remove those tacking stitches that you put in place to hold the seam allowance of the grit flat. So I just used a small pair of scissors for this, or you could use a seam ripper. Just gently undo all the stitches. As long as you've used a long tacking stitch on your machine, doesn't take too long. But do take the time to do this, because you don't want these tacking stitches to be visible. They were only there to make stuffing the pot easier and sewing the cactus in place. And then snip off any of the loose ends of thread and make sure you've taken everything out. So now your Ferocactus is beautifully planted in its pot, and that one's all finished and ready to display. Now for the Saguaro cactus, this is planted in the same way. You measure 2 inches up from the bottom. So I would measure this on one side and then measure it on the other side. And you can measure and mark that on the seams as well, as if you like. But 2 inches of this of the trunk is going to go inside the pot. So take your next pot, which you've already half filled, and put your weighted filling in. Pop the cactus inside, just like you did with the Ferocactus. Place the stuffing inside till it's full, all the way round, and then pin it into place and slip stitch into place all the way round. And then that's what your Saguaro cactus will look like when it's all full. So it looks like it's properly planted in its little pot. Give it a shake. I always find if you rearrange it and give it a shake and a little squeeze, it'll even out. And that's that one finished. Now for the prickly pear, first of all, you need to stitch your 4 stems together. So arrange them so some of them are facing upwards and some of them are facing slightly outwards, because this gives a much more realistic look. So they're overlapping and facing in different directions, because that's how a real prickly pear would look. Once you're happy with their arrangement, they're only just slightly overlapping and facing outwards and upwards. Pin or clip them together. And then we just need to tack them together. So mark 1.5 inches up from the bottom edge of the one that you've got on the top. And just mark that with a pen. I'm just going to move my clips slightly because I want to sew along this line. And then, using a long tacking stitch on your machine, sew together all 4 stems together along that line. And that just holds them all together. Now you also need to measure now 2 inches up from the bottom and mark with a pin, because that's where they will be planted inside, because 2 inches of the prickly pear will be underneath the grit. So just mark that so it's 1/2 inch above your tacking. Then pop this into your third pot, which you've already half filled, and put your weighted filling inside. So push it inside, then fill the rest of the pot up just like you did with the other 2 cacti. Once you've filled it up, I'm just showing you here, you can just pin it into position on either side, because this is obviously a straight rather than a circular edge like the other 2 cacti, but it works in the same way. But do fill all around the edges of the grit before you do that. And then slip stitch it into place in the same way as you did with the other 2. And then it will look like this. Now, as you can see, with all of my stems, they're all facing outwards and flopping, which is a really nice look. It depends what you wanted. I wanted mine to stand up a bit more. So what I did was I sewed them together about 1/3 of the way up the whole stem. or when I went halfway, it was too much, so about a third of the way. Secure the thread through one of the side seams of one of the prickly pear base pads, and then push the needle all the way through to the other side. And then push it back through to the other side again. So you've made a small, tiny stitch through. Then thread your needle through just the top base pad and come out about 1 inch along, and then make a small backward stitch, just a tiny stitch. I tried to do them on top of the little spikes so they'd be hidden. And again, a tiny stitch, a long stitch through, and then a tiny stitch through to the other side. So you're just making a back stitch, but making sure that the stitches are quite small. They are just anchoring stitches, so it doesn't need to be, you don't need to do too many of them. It just holds them together. And then do this all the way along to the end. So I probably worked about 4 or 5 stitches that went through all layers. And then once you get to the end, just work a few small stitches on top of each other, just to secure the thread, and then you can cut it off. And that holds them all together. But it's entirely up to you what effect you want, whether you want them standing upwards or flopping outwards. So that's what it looks like if you've got them all standing upwards. So now all your cacti are finished. So there's the prickly pear, all sewn into place. With this one, I've left it unstitched so it's flopping outwards. But up to you. There's the saguaro with his flowers. And the Ferocactus. Now your trio of cacti are now finished and all ready to display.